I had warned them. The HOA thugs prowling around my lake had been ignoring the rules, trespassing, and pushing boundaries for weeks. I left polite notes, sent formal warnings, even tried reasoning. Nothing worked. One evening, I walked out to the shoreline, and there they were again. Bold, arrogant, acting like they owned the place. My patience snapped. My shotgun, loaded and ready, rested against the dock. The standoff was silent at first, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Would they finally back off, or had I just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? Before all the tension, life on my lakefront property was exactly what I had imagined when I moved out of the city. Mornings were quiet, the water glimmering under soft sunlight, and evenings carried the gentle hum of crickets and frogs. My dock jutted out into the calm water, my small cabin nestled among pines and oaks, and my boat bobbed gently nearby. It wasn't just a home. It was freedom, solitude, a place where the noise of the outside world faded to a whisper. I spent my days maintaining the property, keeping the shoreline clean, and enjoying the small routines that made life peaceful. Fishing early in the morning, checking the docks, tending the garden, or simply watching the mist rise off the water became part of my rhythm. This was a place of privacy, where I could think, reflect, and breathe without interference. The HOA that governed the surrounding properties had always seemed distant. On paper, it existed to enforce rules about aesthetics, docks, and shoreline use. Vague, often petty regulations meant to control behavior more than protect the land. Most residents ignored them, unless they became inconvenient, and for years, I had avoided any real contact. I assumed that my lake, my private dock, and my cabin were mine to enjoy, and that common sense would prevent unnecessary disputes. That assumption proved wrong. One neighbor in particular had grown emboldened by the HOA's presence. They acted as if the lake itself belonged to them, patrolling the shore, questioning who I allowed on my property, and sending passive, aggressive notes about shared responsibilities and community oversight. At first, I tried ignoring it, thinking the hostility was temporary, maybe even a misunderstanding. But the small signs, footprints on the shoreline, unexpected visits, offhand comments about the dock and my boat, hinted at a deeper problem. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before I reacted. It didn't take long for me to realize that this wasn't a casual neighborly quarrel. The HOA, usually a distant administrative body, was enabling behavior that undermined my right to enjoy my own property. They didn't know me, my routines, or the fact that I had experience standing my ground. But I would soon show them that trespassers and entitled enforcers alike had underestimated what it meant to defend my lake, my home, and my peace. Even in the early days of their interference, a sense of tension began to hang over the property like a low fog. I could feel it in the subtle shifts. A strange knock on the dock, a pair of eyes watching from the tree line, or a note left on my boat with more than a hint of threat. The calm that had once defined my lakefront life was beginning to fracture, and I knew one day, sooner or later, a confrontation was inevitable. At first, the HOA's meddling was subtle, almost passive, aggressive. A note here about the dock being non-compliant. A casual reminder about community regulations. There. It seemed harmless, bureaucratic, maybe even routine. I filed them away, thinking these were minor annoyances, the kind of small, town interference people tolerate. But the signs soon multiplied. Footsteps on my shoreline that weren't mine, the occasional glance from across the water that lingered too long, and a sense that someone was always watching began to gnaw at the quiet peace I had fought so hard to find. Then the visits started. A group of HOA representatives, who called themselves community enforcers, began showing up unannounced. At first, they claimed they were conducting routine inspections. They measured my dock, examined my boat, even scrutinized the placement of my fishing lines. Each visit was accompanied by pointed questions. Have you registered your dock with the HOA? Are you aware of the permitted use of shoreline areas? Every inquiry carried an unspoken warning. A challenge. The undercurrent was clear. They were testing me, seeing if I would flinch, seeing if I could be intimidated. I tried to stay calm. I documented everything. I took photos, logged times, wrote detailed notes on every interaction. Yet, even as I prepared for potential legal disputes, the tension escalated. One morning, I discovered a new note stuck to my boat. The paper was crisp, the handwriting sharp. You are not above the rules. We are watching. No signature, no explanation. Just a thinly veiled threat. I stared at it for a long time, the words sinking in. Whoever left it wanted to intimidate me. And it worked. At least for a moment, because for the first time, I felt the isolation of the lake. The vulnerability of being a single homeowner, surrounded by a self-appointed authority. The harassment became physical. Late one evening, I returned to the cabin to find my dock partially disassembled. Some boards were missing, cleats loosened, ropes frayed. Whoever did this had no intention of repair. Just disruption, a clear statement that my property was not entirely under my control. I spent hours fixing it, hands raw, heart pounding with a mix of frustration and fury. Every repair felt like a battle, every step a reminder that I couldn't just enjoy my property in peace. It wasn't just vandalism. Notices began arriving in my mailbox. Fines for non-compliance with rules I hadn't even known existed. Threats of legal action if I didn't cooperate with HOA directives. And letters warning of potential trespassing charges if I challenged their inspections. The absurdity of it weighed on me. I was on my own land, following all local laws, yet suddenly I was the offender in someone else's self-imposed kingdom. The HOA wasn't enforcing safety or property law. They were wielding arbitrary authority to test boundaries, to provoke reactions, to establish control. Then came the most audacious moment yet. One hot afternoon, I spotted a group of them on my shoreline. Not officials inspecting, not neighbors curiously walking by, but a coordinated, deliberate presence. They moved in formation, spreading along the dock and shallow waters, clearly attempting to assert dominance. I watched from the cabin deck, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. They ignored my repeated warnings, claiming community oversight. Yet their behavior screamed intrusion. The audacity was breathtaking. It was at that moment I realized this wasn't going to stop with polite warnings or formal letters. They were testing me, pushing until someone cracked, until someone reacted in fear or anger. I needed a deterrent, something unmistakable that would force them to reconsider. Something that communicated ownership and consequence without hesitation. I had one option left: prepare for a show of force that would make the boundaries of my property clear, beyond doubt. I didn't want a violent confrontation. I wanted them to understand that the lake, the dock, and the surrounding property were mine, and that my rights were not up for debate. I positioned my shotgun in a safe but visible spot near the dock, loaded but pointed away from anyone. It was a warning, not a threat, a clear signal that I was prepared to defend my property if necessary. Even as I took these precautions, the tension escalated further. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I noticed movement along the shoreline. Figures emerged from the tree line, approaching the dock slowly but deliberately. I could hear voices, faint but discernible, discussing the community authority and how I needed to cooperate. Every step they took toward the water tightened the knot of anger and anxiety in my stomach. I remained calm, every muscle tense, eyes tracking each person. They ignored the posted, private property signs, ignored the previous warnings, and even disregarded the presence of the camera I had installed to document every interaction. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my system. This was the moment I had been preparing for. The moment where their test of boundaries would meet the reality of consequences. The HOA enforcers reached the dock. I stepped forward, shotgun clearly visible, stance steady, voice calm but firm. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. They froze, eyes widening as the magnitude of my preparedness sank in. It was a silent standoff. A test not of strength, but of will and awareness. Every second stretched, the sun low on the horizon. The water still, reflecting the tension in the air. And then it happened, they began to retreat. Not immediately, not completely, but hesitation crept into their movements. Steps slowed, hands raised slightly as if in surrender, glances cast back toward the tree line. The message had landed. I was serious, I was prepared, and I would not tolerate continued intrusion. Months of harassment, fines, threats, and trespass attempts culminated in this single moment. A standoff that ended not in violence, but in clarity. Yet even as they backed off, I knew the rising action wasn't truly over. The standoff had shifted the dynamic, but the HOA was a persistent institution. They could regroup, find new allies, or attempt to reinterpret rules to bypass my clear warnings. The tension remained, simmering just beneath the surface. A reminder that vigilance and assertiveness were ongoing responsibilities. In the days that followed, I documented the confrontation thoroughly. Photos of the dock, the positioning of the shotgun, timestamps, and video recordings created a record that would protect me if any claims arose. Every neighbor who had observed the standoff confirmed the sequence of events. Even in retreat, the HOA's actions left a paper trail. Another layer of protection, another line of defense against their ongoing attempts to assert control. Still, the psychological strain lingered. Each sunrise, I watched the water, anticipating potential intrusions, knowing the HOA could attempt another move at any time. I reinforced signs, improved security measures, and continued to document every visit. Months of harassment had created a heightened sense of awareness, a recognition that property rights, even when legally clear, often require visible defense to be respected in practice. The stakes were no longer just about property or fines. They had become about dignity, autonomy, and control over one's own space. The HOA's petty enforcement had escalated into intimidation, but my calm, decisive preparation turned the tables. The rising action was a story of persistence, careful strategy, and the slow build-up to a confrontation that demanded attention and respect. Even in victory, tension remained. Every creak of the dock, every shadow on the shoreline, and every sound in the trees could have been a test, a probe, a challenge. But the rising action had taught a critical lesson: preparation, awareness, and the clear assertion of boundaries could turn months of harassment into an unambiguous deterrent. And, as the sun set over the lake, casting long reflections across the water, I realized that the next moment, the confrontation that would define the outcome, was imminent. The stage was set, the HOA had pushed too far, and all that remained was the climax: a decisive, high-stakes resolution where audacity, intimidation, and entitlement would finally meet unwavering resolve. The question lingered in the air, taut and electric. Would they finally respect the boundaries, Or would their arrogance push them too far, forcing a confrontation they would regret? The day of reckoning arrived like a storm breaking over the lake, sudden, electric, and impossible to ignore. I had spent weeks anticipating this moment, reinforcing the dock, positioning cameras, and making sure every move I made could be documented and defended. But nothing could truly prepare me for the surge of adrenaline as I stepped out onto the sun-warmed boards and saw them. 3 self-appointed enforcers from the HOA, striding confidently across the waterline, measuring tape and clipboards in hand, their smirks daring me to challenge their authority. Each step a provocation that tested every ounce of my patience, and I could feel the tension twisting in my gut, my heartbeat sensing, with the distant lap of waves against the shore, the wind carrying the faint rustle of leaves like whispers of warning. I took a deep breath, reminded myself that this was no longer about small fines or passive, aggressive notes. This was about ownership, about defending the sacred boundaries of my property and my peace of mind. And I stepped forward with the shotgun I had prepared, laid carefully across my shoulders, the polished wood catching the light, the barrel pointed safely to the ground, but unmistakably visible, and the effect was immediate. Their confidence faltered as eyes widened, movements slowed, and the smug smirks faded into hesitation, the air thick with the silent communication of threat, authority, and unshakable resolve. Yet I didn't raise my voice, didn't make a single unnecessary gesture, because the power of the moment was in its stillness, in the controlled tension that screamed more loudly than words ever could, and I could see the calculations racing across their faces as they realized that months of petty intimidation, of trespass, of notes and fines, had met an unmovable wall of preparedness. And as I stepped closer, deliberately, keeping the stance calm and deliberate, my eyes locked on theirs, the wind rustling the leaves overhead like an unseen jury. One of them whispered something to the others, and I could see the doubt creeping in, the awareness that the escalation they had been hoping to provoke might backfire catastrophically. I raised a hand slightly, not threatening but signaling authority, and the taller man hesitated, glancing toward the tree line where my cameras silently recorded every micro-movement, every hesitant step. And for the first time, the idea of accountability seemed to penetrate their bravado. That arrogance which had carried them so far now began to crumble under the weight of consequence and preparation. And the standoff stretched taut like a bowstring, seconds stretching into eternities, the silence punctuated only by the lapping water and the distant calls of birds returning to roost. And then, as if by unspoken consensus, they faltered, one taking a small step back, another lowering the clipboard, and the final man paused mid-step, glancing between the dock and the water, the reality sinking in that they had misjudged me, miscalculated the determination it took to defend what was mine, the message clear and uncompromising: this land, this lake, this dock, and my cabin were not negotiable, they were not shared, and they would not be trifled with. And, in that moment, a rush of vindication coursed through me, tempered by the awareness that control, once reasserted, demanded continued vigilance. Because the HOA, petty and persistent, might regroup, but the precedent had been set, the deterrent undeniable, and my position unassailable. I documented every second, from the hesitant steps to the murmured exchanges, ensuring that if they attempted to reinterpret rules or bring any further claims against me, the record would speak louder than any argument. And as they slowly retreated, casting nervous glances over their shoulders, I felt the culmination of months of harassment, frustration, and preparation crystallize into something palpable, a triumph of strategy and calm resolve over intimidation and entitlement, a moment where the scales of audacity versus accountability balanced decisively in my favor, and yet, even as the immediate threat dissolved, I knew the confrontation wasn't just an end but a pivot, a turning point where every choice I had made, every precaution, every measure of foresight, had paid off, and the realization settled like a weight in my chest. I had not only defended my property, but I had demonstrated unequivocally that trespass, manipulation, and arrogance meet consequences when confronted with readiness and unwavering resolve. And the echoes of the standoff lingered in the air. Long after the last step faded from the shoreline, a silent warning carved into the fabric of the lake itself, and as I lowered the shotgun, steadying my hands, watching them disappear into the trees, I knew the final question hung in the tensioned air, lingering like a promise for what came next. Had they truly learned their lesson, or would audacity dare return to challenge resolve once again? After the standoff at the dock, the lake seemed to breathe a quiet sigh, the tension lingering in the air like the faint scent of pine and water. But beneath that calm was a profound shift. Not just in my own perception of the property, but in the community, in the HOA's understanding of boundaries, and in the lessons etched into everyone's awareness who had witnessed or heard about the confrontation. In the immediate aftermath, I took time to fortify every inch of my property, checking locks, reinforcing the dock, adding visible signage, and ensuring that cameras and sensors were fully operational. Not out of paranoia, but as a tangible reinforcement of what had been asserted with both calm and clarity during the standoff. And as the days turned into weeks, the HOA representatives who had once swaggered along the shoreline with the assumption that authority equaled power began to operate with noticeably more caution. Their movements hesitant, their visits less frequent, and the casual smugness that had defined their behavior dissipated, replaced by wary awareness that trespass and intimidation could no longer be attempted without consequence. Legally, the documentation I had amassed became invaluable. Detailed video footage, timestamps, photographs, and written logs created an unassailable record that could protect me against any future claims or petty fines. And as I reviewed the materials, I realized that months of harassment, monitoring, and calculated preparation had transformed into a powerful shield, one that not only secured my property but also solidified my confidence, reminding me that diligence and foresight are as critical as the rights themselves, because ownership, whether of land or peace of mind, is only meaningful when defended proactively. In the neighborhood, the story spread quickly, first as whispers, then as conversation, and finally as cautious respect. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even tacitly aligned with the HOA's minor interventions began to understand the importance of boundaries. And the lesson resonated beyond my own property. Independence is a privilege that comes with responsibility, vigilance, and assertiveness, and audacity unchecked meets consequences in ways that cannot be ignored. And this shift in community awareness altered the culture of the lakefront permanently, creating a tacit understanding that private property is sacrosanct, and that any attempts at overreach would be met with preparation, determination, and, if necessary, decisive action. Personally, the ordeal left a complex imprint. Relief that the immediate threat had passed, mingled with a lingering recognition of the mental and emotional toll that months of intrusion had exacted, a mix of fatigue, frustration, and the sharp adrenaline of confrontation. But ultimately, these experiences crystallized into lessons about resilience, clarity, and self-reliance. The kind of hard, hard-earned knowledge that can only come from standing firmly in one's truth, knowing precisely when to escalate, when to document, and when to assert authority without aggression yet with unmistakable firmness. Over time, I found a renewed sense of peace. Walking along the shoreline, maintaining the dock, and enjoying the serene rhythm of lake life. But the awareness never fully disappeared. Every sound, every movement, every note or unexpected visit reminded me that vigilance is an ongoing practice, a necessary companion to freedom. Yet the fear and tension that once gripped me were replaced with confidence, the knowledge that I had defended my rights successfully, that trespass and intimidation had been confronted and neutralized, and that the lake, the dock, and the property were once again under my control. The HOA, once emboldened by assumed authority and petty rules, had been publicly humbled, their power checked, and their credibility diminished, not through retaliation or chaos, but through calm, methodical preparation and unwavering resolve, demonstrating that authority has limits when faced with rightful defense, that arrogance is fragile when measured against strategic action, and that a single determined individual can shift the balance of power through foresight and courage. This resolution extended beyond property lines. It was a lesson in human behavior, in the dynamics of entitlement, and in the necessity of standing firm even when bureaucracy, intimidation, or collective pressure seems overwhelming, and the personal growth it fostered was profound, transforming fear and frustration into confidence, teaching that boundaries are not abstract, but living, defendable lines that protect autonomy, dignity, and peace, and that defense of such lines requires not only legal awareness, but psychological preparedness, situational clarity, and the courage to assert limits decisively. Neighbors who had witnessed fragments of the confrontation approached me, cautiously at first, then with questions, then with gratitude, acknowledging that the principles demonstrated were not about aggression, but about fairness, ownership, and responsibility. And this shared understanding subtly shifted the social dynamics of the lake community, reinforcing respect for property and for individuals who choose to stand firm when challenged. Over the months that followed, I continued to monitor the area, maintain the docks and sensors, and cultivate the routines that had defined my peace before the conflict. But now each action carried the knowledge that independence is both precious and fragile, that audacity and entitlement will test boundaries relentlessly, and that preparedness and assertive defense are essential tools in maintaining sovereignty over one's life and property. Reflecting on the ordeal, I recognized that the confrontation, the months of harassment, and the strategic stand at the dock had left an enduring impact, not just on the HOA or on me personally, but on the collective consciousness of the neighborhood. Respect must be earned, trespassers can be checked, and authority is meaningless without accountability. And while calm and vigilance prevented violence, the clarity of the standoff sent a message that could not be misinterpreted. A statement about the consequences of ignoring boundaries, and the way audacity meets steadfast resolve. In essence, the resolution of this conflict reinforced that vigilance, preparation, and assertive action are not just defensive strategies, but proactive statements of ownership and autonomy, and that even in a world where petty bureaucracies and entitled individuals seek to impose themselves, clarity of rights, careful documentation, and unwavering resolve can preserve freedom, protect peace, and restore balance. And as I stand today on the shoreline, watching sunlight glitter across the water, maintaining my property, and enjoying the quiet of a lake no longer threatened by trespass or intimidation, one thought remains etched in my mind, and echoes beyond the waterline. Authority and arrogance may push and provoke, but when met with preparation, patience, and decisive resolve, the lines of ownership and respect are unmistakably drawn, and those who challenge them will always learn that boundaries are not suggestions. They are laws written in action, vigilance, and unwavering principle.